Hello all, I hope you're having a good week and hopefully this narrated PowerPoint helps you get the information that you need from the North House chapter 10 through 11. After watching this PowerPoint, you'll then want to make sure that you go online on My Methodist and complete the discussion board, also titled North House chapter 10 through 11. So first, chapter 10 talks about conflict, and this is a really important chapter in the book. North House talks about that there is always going to be conflict. No matter what we try to do as leaders, as managers, conflict is inevitable. So it's not about how do we prevent conflict, but more how can we manage conflict and then produce positive change. We often think about conflict as being a bad thing, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes conflict can bring about really good positive changes. So going into a conflict situation with a more positive outlook may also help resolve the conflict in a more effective manner as well. So we will talk about defining conflict, the different types of conflict, the different negotiation and communication strategies that can be helpful, and then the different styles of approaching conflict. So as we go through this, I want you to think about how do you define conflict, and what are the types of conflicts that you're most likely to encounter in the workplace or even in your personal, professional lives? And what have your strategies been for dealing with conflict in the past? And hopefully after reading this chapter and thinking about this a little bit, you might have some new strategies that may be even more helpful. So first, this North House is really talking about interpersonal conflict in this book. There, of course, is intrapersonal conflict, but this we're really talking about a struggle between two or more individuals or parties. It can be groups of people. But in order, kind of how he defines conflict, these four things need to be present. First, there has to be a struggle. There has to be a clash between, like I said, two or more people or parties. And then there has to be interdependence. This means that these individuals have to be connected or work with each other in some way. We may not like something that a driver did that drove past us. Maybe he threw something out the window and we don't like littering, but we may never see that person again. So that conflict is likely to be short-lived or be non-existent. But if we have a relationship with this person, then there's interdependence, and therefore the conflict, there's conflict. North House has us think about how much influence do we want to have on the relationship, and how much influence am I willing to accept. Basically that means how much control do I want to have, and how much am I okay with somebody controlling me. For example, in the workplace, we may be okay with our manager or supervisor telling us what to do, even if maybe we disagree or we don't like it. We might not say anything and bring it up and create a conflict because we're okay with that that relationship of power. But in other situations, often when we are with a peer or someone of equal status, we want to have equal influence in that relationship. We want there to be equal power. And so therefore that conflict is going to exist, and we're going to want to resolve it in some way. Next are feelings. So in this definition of conflict, there's the struggle, there's interdependence, we have a relationship with each other, and then there's some feelings involved. That includes, it can be anything from anger, sadness, loneliness, feelings of abandonment. And these emotions or these feelings can be very strong and can make dealing with the conflict even more difficult. And then lastly, there has to be some differences between the two parties that appear to be incompatible. So I want to work the night shift, you want to work the night shift. Those are differences that seem like seem incompatible. Therefore, there's a conflict there. North House also divides up conflict into two different ways: content conflict and relational conflict. And we're not going to go into a lot of depth on these two different types of conflicts. What I want you to know is that content conflicts are usually over policies and procedures. So this is, there's a policy in place I don't like, somebody does something in a certain way, they have a procedure for doing things that I don't like, But then relational is more, I don't like how the person does it. So it's not what they do, it's not the content of what they do, but rather it's how they do it. And this is often when we hear people talk about, we just have a personality clash, and or we just don't get along. It's just the way people operate or the way people work creates a conflict. So this can be difficult. Both content and relational conflict can be difficult, but relational conflict often can be more challenging because it's not about what somebody did or how somebody did it, but more a core part of who they are. So then Northouse gets into talking about some of the different approaches to resolving conflict. And I think this, if you take anything away from this chapter, I want you to take this away. This is important. This comes from the Fisher and Urey book called Getting to Yes, which is one of the recommended texts. It's not a book that we'll read for this class, but it is recommended. It goes into this in much greater detail. But principled negotiation is one way of approaching conflict that can be very effective. And it's not going to be applicable in all situations, but there's 4 principles that I think are that make up this approach that are really important. First, we want to separate the people from the problem. Often in conflict, we are so focused on the person. Well, I don't like you. I don't like how you act. I don't like how you said this. I don't like what you do or what you did, as opposed to just focusing on what is the problem. So the problem is you're coming late to work, but we focus on, oh, you're lazy. You don't care about us. You don't care about, the team or the patients. And so we focus on the person and not the real problem, which is, you're late to work and we need to figure out a way to make sure that everybody's to work on time. So working side by side to attack the problem and not each other can be really helpful. Taking the person out of it, can also lessen those emotions. Next is that we want to focus on interests, not positions. And what they mean by positions is your point of view on something. And so we may have a position or a belief about a certain issue, using abortion as an example. My position on abortion, my position may be I'm pro-life, I'm against abortion in all situations and all cases, whereas somebody else's position is pro-choice and they believe it's the woman's right to choose whether or not to carry a pregnancy to full term. So those are our positions. But then what are our particular interests? What are the relevant needs and values? Because we might not be able to convince somebody who's pro-life to be pro-choice or vice versa, but we may recognize that there's mutual interests, where we have shared needs or values. And maybe the most important thing that both of us can agree on is that women who are pregnant should receive good prenatal care. Whether we're pro-life or pro-choice, we believe that all women should have, good prenatal care. So that's an interest that we can share, but if we never get beyond our positions, we never get there. So we want to focus on interests, not positions. Next is we want to look for a win-win situation. So we want to invent options for mutual gain. Often when we think about conflict, we think one person wins, one person loses. There's often an opportunity for to brainstorm an option that both people can agree with, that both people can get on board with, and finding that compromise or finding that option is really important for people to walk away from the conflict feeling good about it. And then lastly, their principle 4 is insist on using objective criteria. In some situations, objective criteria is not available. But I think about a situation when you're selling your car, okay? There's a conflict, you're selling your car for $5,000 and the person thinks it's only worth $4,000. Well, maybe we can agree on, you know what, I priced the car the way it is because of the Kelley Blue Book value, which is some objective criteria that looks at what is the value of the car based on the year, the model, and the miles, and so forth. So sometimes there's some objective criteria that we can use to help us solve the conflict, as opposed to you and I just going back and forth arguing, we can say, you know, instead of continuing in this way, let's pull in some objective criteria that might be able to help us solve this problem. So when that's available, it can be really helpful. So I have a YouTube or an example from of how to deal with conflict. And so if you get a chance, you can click on that link. Then Northouse goes into talking about different communication strategies that can be helpful when dealing with conflict. And we're not going to go into a great detail on these either. But first, sometimes it can be helpful to focus on differentiation, which is basically define the conflict and then focus on what are the differences so that we are clear on what are we really arguing about. Have you ever been in an argument and you realize at the end of it, it's like, I really don't even know what that was about. What didn't we agree on? But we're just arguing for arguing's sake. So differentiation is really defining that conflict well and finding out what are those differences. And then once we know what those differences are, maybe we can find a solution. The other one, fractionation, is basically just taking a conflict that is very large and overwhelming and breaking it down into small, manageable pieces. So if you're working on a floor and there are just tons of problems, you've got high turnover, poor patient satisfaction, bad outcomes, poor leadership, okay, where do you start? You break that down into small, manageable pieces and say, okay, you know what? This is what we're going to work on first, just this one thing, not everything all at once. And then lastly is what they call face saving, which is basically an attempt to help each other save face in a conflict. So once we've had this conflict and it's been resolved, how can we basically make each other look good? And this is, you know, in terms of companies that are maybe in conflict with, if there's two companies fighting or had a conflict, one can maybe say something publicly positive about that other company or about the other organization that they work for. Other face-saving things that you can do in a more in a smaller sense is give some, you know, be okay with giving some people some credit when you're in an argument. Say, you know what, you did make a good point there, or I appreciate how you looked at it in this way, and that can just help people feel a little bit better about the conflict. Then there's this is the other big takeaway from this chapter is the Kilman and Thomas model, and these are the 5 different conflict styles, and I'll be asking you to take the questionnaire at the end of this chapter to figure out which conflict style you're most likely to exhibit. So there's avoiding, which is when they talk about this in terms of assertiveness and cooperativeness. Assertiveness is how willing you are to really assert your own needs and your own concerns, whereas cooperativeness is how willing you are to satisfy the needs and concerns of others. And we want a good balance there. Avoiding means you just avoid the conflict at all costs. This is very low on assertive and very low on cooperativeness. You basically just pretend like the conflict doesn't exist, and that typically is not helpful in resolving a conflict. The next one is accommodating. This is when you don't really assert your own needs. You don't say what you need out of the conflict, but just whatever the other person wants is fine. So we're having a conflict over where we should go for dinner, Pizza Hut or McDonald's. I want to go to Pizza Hut, you want to go McDonald's, and so I'm just going to accommodate and we go to McDonald's. And this is, people, over time, if you're always accommodating, you can grow to be resentful. It doesn't feel good to never get what you need or what you want out of a situation. And then there's competing, which is very high on asserting your own self. So you tell people exactly what you need, but you're not really interested in what other people's needs are. And then lastly is one of the other styles is collaborating, where you are interested in getting what you need, but you're also interested in making sure other people get their needs met. And then in between that is compromising. So in an ideally we want to be collaborating, because in compromising, neither of us get a